Hi, it's Amanda Lindquist, Master Gardener here. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about doing some landscape planning for your yard. So, we're going to start by using an example from my own yard and how I transformed a space over time. So, the first step, understand your location. What's your light exposure? What are any structures that are nearby? Do you have irrigation there? Can you get irrigation there? Are there other water sources? And what's the size or footprint for the area? Those are all pretty important things that you need to think about when you're first making a plan to re-landscape an area. Another thing you need to think about are the soil conditions in the area that you're thinking about planting. Do you have mostly clay? Is it a sandy loam? Is it a pretty decent potting soil in there that's been amended over the years? You need to think about your soil conditions as well. And here we have a picture of my front yard. We moved into this house in 2018, and at that time, in this little side yard area that I share with my neighbor, there was their bottle brush tree, which was massive, and my pine tree, which was also massive. And that's a case of wrong tree, wrong location for both. That was just a terrible decision. And you might be wondering, well, what's so bad about it? Well, the side yard area itself is very, very small footprint. So the roots are going to have to grow underneath the concrete and potentially be pushing up the foundation. The trees themselves are really, really huge and overshadow the homes. And as you can see, actually grow over the homes and over the roof in several points. And then my pine tree specifically is kind of hard to see in this picture, but it's actually leaning. And so when you have two very big trees that are very tall like this and they're very difficult to prune, you end up with a situation where you have a hazard that could potentially damage property in a good storm. And this is what it looked like because eventually my neighbor got tired of their bottle brush tree and removed it. And this is what my pine tree looked like without the bottle brush neighbor. Over the years, after much pruning to remove these long limbs that were obstructing the garage, you end up with this poor tree, which is totally top heavy and actually only has growth on one half of it because the bottle brush was on the other side impeding growth, and it leans. This poor thing was doomed from the start. And indeed, less than a year after the bottle brush tree was removed, my poor pine tree succumbed to heat stress and was attacked by borer beetles and died. And not too long after that, I got a compliance letter from the HOA telling me I needed to do something with this little side yard area. So here we begin our story. So here's a picture of this area when both trees were still there. But you can see it's pretty much enveloped in shadow. And that's not from the tree, that's actually from my house. And my house actually faces north. So what that means is during the hottest part of the day, when the sun is more towards the south, the house actually blocks the sunlight. So anything that's on the north side of the house is going to be in shade during the mid to late afternoon period. So what you would say is that this is a northern exposure or a north-facing exposure. And that's important because it kind of informs the types of plants that you can and cannot plant here. So because there is so much shadow here, whatever I plant in this location has to be either shade loving to an extent or something that will grow tall enough to get light from over the house, which I do not want another situation with a ginormous pine tree. So anything I plant there is actually going to be fairly small, medium to small size. So we're going to try to plant stuff that tolerates shade. The second thing you need to think about is the soil type here. You know, what is the drainage like? What is the nutrient density? What are you dealing with here? So I actually did do a soil test, and there is another video about the soil tests on our YouTube page. And I checked it out, and sure enough, it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. It's mostly heavy clay. So one of the things that I have to kind of overcome is increasing drainage in this area. Lucky for me, I had an abundance of gravel there, so I've been able to really mix that into the soil and kind of break up the clay. That really helps with the drainage. And beyond that, over the years, I will need to amend that area with organic matter, so decomposed wood and different kinds of things to kind of help condition that soil as well, just to help me increase the drainage over time. Another consideration is, what's your irrigation like in your area that you're thinking of landscaping? Do you have irrigation? And lucky me, when I moved in, there was no irrigation here. I later discovered through a process of installing irrigation that there once had been irrigation here, but it had been cut off and destroyed at some point in the past. So what I had to do was figure out how to do that. And I looked up this really awesome video, how to build your own water pick. So I was able to tunnel with the water pick underneath the sidewalk there and tap into the irrigation I already had installed in the back so that I could extend the irrigation and make sure I had a good irrigation system in that area to water anything that I put in that area in the future. This is a link to the video that I used to help me build my water pick, and it's the way that I was able to install a conduit and extend irrigation from my backyard into that front side area. I highly recommend it. Call before you dig. Arizona Blue Stake is a free service that will actually help you understand what's underground so you don't die by accidentally hitting an electrical line while you're digging. So before you start designing, you should probably have an idea of what it is you want to design. And one of the best ways that you can kind of do that is to look online and see what other people are doing out there. And I knew that I wanted a kind of dry creek bed. And there were some practical reasons for that as well. But I like the look of it. I like the use of those big river rocks. I like river rocks. I happen to have an excessive amount of river rocks in my backyard that I need to figure out what to do with. And I like the fact that you can put river rock down and it can act as a kind of mulch and help keep the soil wet underneath. And that will actually help you use less water over time. So I looked around online. I got an understanding of what it takes to make a dry creek bed. I got an understanding of the kind of plants that look good with a dry creek bed. And I really just kind of did my homework to figure out, how do I make that work in that space? What is it that I'm really going for in that space? Bubble mapping is a really, really, really fun little tool that you can use to help you think out your space. And I'm kind of a visual person. I need to really be able to see it and think about how things are going to go together, especially when you're talking about plants that can grow out to be much, much bigger than how they start. It's really nice to be able to have a piece of paper to kind of draw stuff out and have an idea of what it will look like in the future. So in this case, the area that I'm bubble mapping is very, very simple. It's just a simple rectangle. It's 6.5 feet by 17 feet and 3 inches. In this case, I'm using graph paper, and each little square is 6 inches by 6 inches. So 2 squares are a full foot. Once I've drawn out my rectangle, I'm going to put in all of the existing structures that I really can't do anything about so that I can draw my bubble map around them. There's the weird electrical box that my neighbor and I have to share. Can't plant there. And there's the SRP water, so they can check and see how much water I'm using. I can't plant anything there. And so and I know that I wanted a dry riverbed. I also know that since that pine tree died, I'm no longer in compliance, so I'm going to have to make room for a tree there. So there I am, doing my riverbed, and that circle is actually going to be the well that I'm going to build around the tree to create a nice area of depression so that I can make sure that all of my water is getting to my tree roots. So there's my little tree. And I was actually gifted a bunch of pots, and I really love the look of pots spilling over with flowers, so put those in. And I'm also, with these little arrows, reminding myself of how I want my drainage to be. So I need to, when I'm digging my creek bed, dig it out lower than the surrounding area so that the water drains into it. And I decided that for this season at least, I'm just going to do annuals. So annuals are a kind of plant that only live for a single season. And so in that case, I'm not going to do a full bubble map. I'm just going to do kind of color blocking so that I can get an idea of what it is that I want to put there. But you could actually draw out circles in different shapes. And this is the same thing done on PowerPoint. I was thinking about my color blocking, and I created a grid, and I drew in all of the structures and started thinking about it. This is another thing you can do with bubble mapping. So this is also to scale. And I was thinking about doing these funny little shapes in the landscape, and you can kind of bubble map all that out. The other thing you can do is think about specific kinds of bushes and plants, and you can actually draw out their full sizes so you can get an idea of what you actually have space for in the landscape after your plants have fully grown in, because a lot of things that people will do is they'll plant plants when they're very young and think, oh, that looks great, and not really think ahead about how big those plants will become in the future. Here we have a picture of the design actually executed in that side yard area. And this is where our earlier landscape considerations really become important. So any of the plants that I pick, any of the soil amendments that I do, any of my irrigation plan, all of that now comes together from our previous planning and understanding of the space. The other thing you want to think about as well is not just what you do want to plant here, but what you don't want to plant here. And because I absolutely do not want to be fighting grasses and weeds in the Dry Creek riverbed area, I did think about a landscape fabric or a weed barrier. So there is underneath all of that river rock a weed barrier so that I don't have stuff growing in there that I don't want in that location. So consider that as well. What are the areas that are just totally unacceptable for you to have plants? So right plant, right location. It's a small space, it's north facing, and it's mostly heavy clay. So what do I have to do to make sure I've got the right plants in this location? Well, I should go for smaller plants that are more shade loving and are going to be tolerant of a soil that doesn't drain as well. So how do I pick the right plant for the right place, and how do I create a space that really flows with my vision? And remember, I wanted a dry creek bed with lots of green plants. And you might be thinking, well, that's kind of impossible to do in Arizona, but really, it's not. So here's my vision of what it is I ultimately would kind of like my dry creek bed to look like. So one answer to that is to find lookalike plants that are adapted to the Arizona desert. And the Val Vista Lakes Homeowners Association has this extraordinary list of a couple of hundred different plants, and they're divided out by normal water use and low water use. So you could actually, one way to do this is go through and say, okay, I'm looking for ground covers, or I'm looking for perennials, or I'm looking for whatever, and you can take a look at them by their picture and try to find some lookalike plants that way, and find some low water use lookalikes that you can plant in your area. Again, here's the vision. You could go to your local nursery, take a picture of what it is you're looking for, and find lookalike plants at your nursery. Or you can use the Maricopa County Master Gardener planting lists, and they have some pretty awesome resources to help you find plants that are adapted to the Arizona heat and Arizona desert condition. For myself, because I decided I was going to do annuals this season, and I wanted a nice fall garden, I took this list with me to the local nursery, and I compared what can be planted right now with what was actually in stock, and picked the stuff that had those gold colors and blue colors and purple colors that I was looking for. And as much as possible, I tried to pick plants that were tolerant of shade and were not as sensitive to having wet roots. That's not always easy to do, so I'll just have to be really conscious of the water in that area and probably water lightly so I don't drown my plants. So here is my bubble map, and I took my little map and the seeds that I bought from the nursery, and I sprinkled them all over in the sections where I wanted those colors. And here you can see the seeds are starting to sprout, and it's so exciting. Look at those little baby plants. And the plan is that once I have lots of good sprouts, I will thin them out so it looks more intentional and looks more like the blooms are actually spilling out of the little pots. And there you have it. That's how you re-landscape a space. Well, this is Amanda Lindquist signing out. I hope that you enjoyed that video. I hope that it was informative and helpful for you while you're landscaping your areas in your yard. There will be another video coming in which I go into a lot more detail about how you can use bubble mapping for a bigger, less simple shape. Like, for example, maybe your entire property or your entire backyard. And we have lots more videos to look at and lots more videos coming. So check out our YouTube page. Go ahead and subscribe. And don't forget, we're still funding a community garden. So if you haven't done it yet, purchase your paper. Thanks all. Bye.